Welcome to part three of How the Self Evolves. This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Again, welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. So, in this episode, we're delving into Robert Kegan's Stage 4, the Self Authoring Mind. So, what's going on with the self authoring mind? Well, if you viewed the last episode about the socialized mind, if you live in a traditional culture, the socialized mind might be sufficient to be an adult because the culture or your religion, whatever framework that you've been socialized into, has clear directives for how to be a parent, how to be a worker, how to be a husband, right and wrong, and that's sufficient. But in a modern society, a multicultural society where you have so many different frameworks and so many ways of understanding the world, this socialized mind becomes too limited in a sense. It doesn't quite map onto the complexities of a modern world. So when people move towards the self authoring mind, they begin to take as objects, meaning to get perspective on the ideas and expectations that they had internalized and been subject to as part of the cultural surround. So now you take a step back and you begin to look at, your own culture, the societal expectations, the stuff that you were previously fused with, and you view that through the new vantage point or the new subject of your own inner system of values and principles and premises. That's the gist of the socialized mind. Now remember, or the self-authoring mind. Now remember, the socialized mind could do idealism. The self-authoring mind has a tendency to be more ideological. So at the self-authoring mind, you could still be a Democrat, you could be a Republican, you could be a libertarian, you could be an anarchist, you could be Christian, Muslim, agnostic, atheist. That's not really the point. The point is that you're likely to have your own take on these particular ideologies. You have your own inner seat of authority and judgment, your own take on these things. That's what's really different from the socialized mind. So if we look at, for example, relationships, romantic relationships, and of course, with the socialized mind, we tend to be made up by our relationships. In the previous video, I mentioned that typical conflict of let's say, the husband who has a mother who's overly invested in his marriage, and his wife is going nuts and wants the husband to set boundaries, and he's not quite able to do so because he's trying to please, in a sense, like his very sense of self is made up of how he thinks other people view him. So that conflict between his wife and his mother is often felt like an internal tearing of sorts. And closeness, in the socialized relationship, is very often about a kind of shared mutual inner experience, that unity of we share the same being. The self-authoring relationship is different because what's happening here is that instead of having a self that's made up by one's relationships, the self now can have a relationship to its relationships. And on the one hand, that might sound less romantic because now you have two independent, complete, distinct selves who are complete in themselves entering into a partnership. On the one hand, that kind of takes away from that romantic notion of unity and having a shared being, essentially. but simultaneously it opens up for a new form of intimacy, a deeper one in a sense, because the self-authoring partner can allow other people way more of their own individuality because differences are no longer threatening in the same way. So there's more often an emphasis on you do your thing and I do my thing, and we kind of connect. The self-authoring partner, of course, this also depends on his personality tendencies and other factors as well, but the self-authoring partner can allow, in quotation marks, his or her partner more of their own individuality, to be their own person, because their own sense of self is no longer made up by how they think their partner may be perceiving them. And they can allow that, difference in individuality because they have access to more of their own individuality. So this is different. At this stage of development, people can truly be more tolerant in a sense. That tendency to automatically make people who see the world differently wrong or mistaken is not so prevalent. Here you more often get notions such as, we can agree to disagree. We don't have to agree. We don't have to agree. We don't have to cancel or necessarily combat someone who sees the world differently than we do. Conflict here is different. Conflict is more internal. So conflict here is when two premises or values or principles of the self-authored person's inner system of authority or ideology clashes. So conflict at this stage of development is way more internal. Simultaneously, as the person can be more tolerant towards other people's ideas in a sense, because they're not as threatened by differences. There's often less of a tendency to seek approval and to do people pleasing and to speculate what other people want to hear and to say that. So this person might also have stronger boundaries and come across as way less diplomatic and hold other people responsible for their own emotions, and they're less likely to hold other people as responsible for their own inner experience. So here you have a person who has more a sense of boundaries usually. Now the person may be career oriented and have goals for self actualization and stuff like that, or the person may not be oriented in that direction. The person might, for example, make their relationships in life the most important thing. So if you make a distinction here between content and structure, it's very easy to think that, oh yeah, the socialized mind, that person's life is going to primarily revolve around, for example, their relationships with friends and family and kids, and that self-authored mind is likely to be more career or achievement driven. Might be the opposite. It might be that the socialized mind, is a lawyer and works for a law firm and has internalized that cultural surround and co-constructs his own sense of self based upon how well he's succeeding in that status achievement game as a lawyer. And it might be that the self-authoring person is not that into career achievement, but places a way stronger emphasis on his or her personal relationships. So keep that in mind as well. Also, so authority is now more found in the self. Now this person, if they're open, might still be very open to how other people think and how other people do things, and be curious, and but at the end of the day, everything gets filtered through the self-authored system or filter of values and principles and premises. If we look at psychology, or if you look at work first, if someone's truly self-authored, they're less likely to be a typical clone. So let's say that the person is truly self-authoring, and whether they're a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer or a school teacher or whatever it might be, they're less likely to resemble the stereotype of a doctor or school teacher or engineer or lawyer or whatever it might be. They're more likely to, again, have their own stance and take on things, and to show more of their own individuality, and be more open to see the individuality of other people. They're less likely to be the heavy-handed, bureaucrat who follows procedure, to the core. So that's something else to look at too. Now, in terms of, for example, coaching or psychotherapy or change work, and by the way, I'm not taking for granted here that anyone listening to this does the psychological illusion model that I teach. So I'm talking about psychotherapy and coaching in general. The self-authoring mind has a tendency to more view themselves as the source of their own experience. So there's less that tendency to attempt to please others, to fit in, or to tell other people what they want to hear, less to not offend someone usually. There's less of that victim stance of "you make me feel." Now, of course, in real life, someone who's at the self-authoring mind might still say, "My daughter's driving me crazy," "my wife is pissing me off," and it might even feel that way in the moment. But when their mind clears, or in the back of their mind, they know it's not really like that. They know that it's how I interpret things. It's my experience is constructed within me. All right, and this is an advantage, because now you can suddenly realize that what someone else is saying and what I'm hearing is different, because hearing is a process of interpretation. So that's a big strength as well. The client who enters psychotherapy or coaching from more of a self-authoring mind is less likely to look for an expert to tell them what to do and to conform to that. I mean, they might if they have very little knowledge about the topic, right? So, in any context, if someone goes into a workforce or they start studying something new, they kind of might look like socialized minds, because who's going to have a strong take on something that they haven't really explored or gone into yet? But the client who seeks therapy or coaching here might be more likely to look for a sparring partner, or a coach that they can spar with, that they can have more of a mutual exploration of things, where they get to decide on their own behalf and they get to push back. And this is a great strength too for the psychologist or the coach or the psychotherapist who has that self-authoring mind, is that their own authority is not as easily rattled or challenged if they have a client who has an independent mind, who might be pushing back a bit, or who may not just want to conform, but may want to be an active participant in the process. Someone who's more self-authoring can allow that. It's been quite interesting for me throughout the years in seeing clients, because that mid zone, that transition between stages is more common than someone being strongly at the nodal level of a stage, right? So where you likely see the most adults in the Western world is somewhere in that mid-zone transition between the socialized mind and the self-authoring mind. So when you speak with them and you deal with them, you're likely to see strong flavors of both. You have that more socialized orientation, and you have elements of that self-authoring orientation, going on. Susanne greuter, the ego development researcher, in the ego development model, that's actually a distinct stage called the experts. And a lot of leaders, and professionals operate here. Here it's often a kind of, I'm special, I'm unique, I'm kind of different, I'm in charge, I can lead type. But that genuine capacity for self-reflection and self-authorship isn't really developed yet. And I've seen with my clients, when I've seen medical doctors, psychologists, lawyers, engineers, seems like a lot of them operate here. A lot of the technocrats operate here. Where was I going with that? See if I can find my thread of thought here again. Yeah, one point I wanted to make with that is, just because someone's a leader or in a leadership position or they're highly educated, don't conflate that with the person necessarily having developed a self-authoring mind. Even if someone's assertive or undiplomatic or very self-expressive and shows a willingness to lead, don't necessarily equate that with a self-authoring mind either. What you'll very often find is that their authority is kind of borrowed, or an expression of the socialized mind or the profession or the culture in which they are identified. So you see a lot of orthodoxy in these professions. Um, Now, here's an interesting thing. I mentioned in the video on the self-sovereign mind, Andrew Tate, and I made pretty clear that I said I don't necessarily think that self-sovereign mind is Andrew Tate's limits. I don't know him. But what I am saying is that his teachings, what he presents and the way he presents it, is very likely to resonate strongly with that self-sovereign mind. If you make a contrast with Jordan Peterson, his teachings are yes, you'll get that transition between the self-sovereign and socialized mind, but you also have a strong call towards self-authorship. Now, what I see is that I see a lot of journalists and people who criticize who conflate the two. They talk about toxic masculinity, and they kind of put Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate and his teachings in the same box. I remember when I studied spiral dynamics with Chris Cowan, he talked about the Dutch disease. And if you're familiar with spiral dynamics, what he was pointing to was that people who operated, more from that blue system, which kind of correlates a little bit with the socialized mind, they often have trouble distinguishing the red system, which kind of corresponds with the self-sovereign mind, and the orange system, which has some resemblance to Kegan stage 4 or the self-authoring mind. They can't really make that distinction. So if you look at Andrew Tate, his ideas of success seems very much to be about dominance and power and conquest and controlling other people and driving fancy cars and being surrounded by hot women and you know, having big biceps, and it's that kind of transactional, exploitative, manipulative. I mentioned previously that whole thing about him bragging on YouTube about exploiting lonely men by taking women he had seduced and kind of getting them to scam these lonely men for all their money. That's not at all the kind of self-authorship that a guy like Jordan Peterson's pushing. If you look at his teachings, it's not about hedonism or sensory pleasure or conquest or domination and being cunning. It's about creating a meaningful life, living a principled life of values, being able to have mutually fulfilling strong relationships, taking personal responsibility, having an ethical code. That speaks more to the kind of socialized and self-authoring minds. It's quite different, but a lot of people don't necessarily make the distinction. So where can you find examples of this self-authoring mind? Well, you can find it all over the place. I mean, in the world of psychotherapy and personal change, if you look at people like Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, or William Glasser, the founder of choice theory, or anyone who's kind of created their own framework and organized their own system of doing things. Anyone who's able to take a step back from their own education and background and have their own take on it is likely operating from that more self-authoring mind. Again, I mentioned Jordan Peterson. If you look at the stuff that he teaches, he's trained as a psychologist, but he's taking elements of neuroscience and evolutionary psychology and psychoanalysis and developmental psychology and other approaches, and he's taking a step back and he's weaving his own kind of integrated version, Jungian psychology. He's integrating his own version of this and teaching it. That would be the hallmark of a strong self-authoring mind, just the capacity to do that. Another public figure which is interesting here is, if you look at Joe Rogan, one thing I really like about Joe Rogan, and this doesn't just speak to self-authoring capacities, but it speaks to someone who would score very high on openness to experience. And of course, not everyone who operates from that self-authoring mind have that level of curiosity and level of openness. But if you look at what he's able to do as an interviewer, meaning he can have pretty deep and meaningful, rich conversations with people who hold very different models of the world. So he can bring in a conspiracy theorist type like Alex Jones and enter into his worldview enough that he can have a meaningful conversation out of that. And then he could get like a very rationalist guy like Sam Harris, for example, the neuroscientist philosopher, and he can have a great conversation with him, and then he can have someone who has a very different mindset, and once again he can have a very rich conversation with him. So that ability to be able to have deep, good conversations with people who see the world radically differently and not be threatened by it, but kind of allowing people that individuality, you would probably have to have a self-authoring mind to be able to do that. If we talk about change work and therapy again, this whole, you know, what a lot of these therapies like CBT and REBT, and a lot of what they try to do is to teach people the kind of capacities of a self-authoring mind, to see that you are the one who's making inferences and interpretations and creating a story and making meaning, and that you can question those assumptions and you can change your story, and you can look for other ways of viewing things, and you can coordinate multiple perspectives simultaneously, where you are kind of the ultimate judge of what what you want to believe in, or what you want to value, and so on and so forth. So um, one reason why people who have self-authored minds are better suited as coaches or therapists than people with socialized mind, everything else being equal, is that they don't have that tendency to be simultaneously over responsible and under responsible. You know, that tendency to say, you make me feel, and also I'm responsible for your happiness. There's more that ability to say, look, that's your inner experience and that's your responsibility, and this is my inner experience, and that's my responsibility. So that's an important thing to look at as well. And very interesting regarding differences. I remember I was teaching at a meditation retreat many years ago, and one of the guys there, I had good conversations with him. He used to work as a professor of journalism. And we ended up discussing the national Norwegian TV channel, NRK, which in Norway, if you want to watch TV, you're forced to pay for that, right? And we got into a discussion about that, where I said, look, I really think that the taxpayer should not be forced to subsidize NRK. And he said, no, I strongly disagree. I said, why? And he said, well, we need NRK to promote diversity. We needed to promote diversity. I said to him, well, let me ask you this. How many conservatives work at NRK? And he kind of chuckled and he smiled and he said, maybe no one. I said, how many libertarians? How many anarchists? Probably no one. So NRK here in Norway is a propaganda channel for the Norwegian Labour Party, the kind of leftist official narrative. It's the same here as CNN in the States, or the function that Fox News shares as a propaganda channel for the Republicans, right? But that forum, that way of conceptualizing diversity, meaning if you have someone who's left-leaning and you have one person who's black and one person's Hispanic and one person's white and someone's in a wheelchair and you have young people and old people, then you have diversity. Well, everything but intellectual diversity. You know, anything but someone who operates from a different set of assumptions and has a different way of understanding the world. That's exactly what you don't get in this TV channel that's supposed to be there to push for diversity. So you see this in politics, you know, where someone goes, oh yeah, you know, I identify with Trump because he's white, you know, or because he's a businessman, or on the other side, you know, Kamala Harris, you know, she's black or Indian or a woman, and it's time to have a, you know, that's a more socialized way of the person who's self-authoring could lean in all sorts of political directions. That's not the point. But he or she is more likely to say, you know what? I'd rather see representation by someone who thinks like me, who shares more of my values and premises, and whether the person's black or a woman or white or a businessman, or that's probably not that important. So that's also another thing to kind of look at. it's really important too when you look at this self-authoring mind again to make a differentiation between what you think or values and structure. So, I mentioned Ayn Rand, the objectivist philosopher. Clearly, if you want to look at an example of self-authorship or a self-authoring mind, Ayn Rand is a prime example of that. But as I mentioned in the video about the socialized mind, sure, many of the people who identify with objectivism or libertarianism probably have those self-authoring capacities, but far from all of them. Many of the people who were part of her collective, as they said, were probably in that socialized, self-authored mid-zone, or even the socialized mind, where they had internalized objectivism and they tried to be an individualist as defined by objectivism and Ayn Rand. And you see this in a lot of the kind of successful self-help programs out there. There's that kind of mid-zone between the self-authoring and socialized mind where, become successful or become an independent person as defined by this particular ideology, as defined by us. If you look at Tony Robbins, for example, uh, and Jordan Peterson, there's that. On the one hand, they are kind of imposing or offering people, guidelines to live by. Uh, but then you can be a successful person in how you live that essentially. So it kind of paces both of those minds and probably really strongly resonates with what Susanne Greuter would call that expert stage. By the way, Susanne Greuter has a excellent series on ego development on YouTube. So if you punch in her name and the expert, you'll see a very vivid description of that stage of development. It's quite interesting. You'll meet a lot of adults who operate there. Here's something really interesting too to keep in mind, and Kegan makes this point quite well in his book In Our Heads, where he talks about these liberation theories, these kind of leftist academic, feminism and queer theory, and whether it's Black Lives Matter or these what you could call identities of being a victim and being oppressed. And he makes the point that not only do a lot of people get socialized into those sorts of ideologies, but some people even build a self-authored identity out of them, meaning they build their own identity and have their own take on being a survivor, for example, or how they have been oppressed or been a victim. One person's teachings who comes to mind a little bit there is Dr. Ramani Durvasola. I did a critique video on her a while back if you're interested. Her teachings on narcissism and recovering from narcissistic abuse. And here you see a lot of that kind of promoting of that survivor, kind of victimized mentality, but where people kind of, well, you can take a step back and build your own identity out of how you were gaslit or the survivor of narcissistic relationships or something like that. That can be a form of self-authorship too that looks quite different. Now, through my particular vantage point, that may more look like a refusal to grow up, but that's just my particular vantage point. Something else that's interesting to notice too, I mentioned Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand's main protege was a guy called Nathaniel Branden. And in 1969, he was the guy who essentially started the self-esteem movement, releasing the book, The Psychology of Self-Esteem. Uh, Robert Kegan, by the way, in several of his books, quotes Nathaniel Branden, talking about leadership and stuff like that, and kind of pushes him as an example of how a self-authoring mind could think. I highly recommend, by the way, Nathaniel Branden's book, The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem. If you really want, like, how would a strongly self-authored mind operate and write, what might that look like? That would be a good book. Now, here's the interesting thing. When the whole concept of self-esteem only really makes sense at that self-authoring mind level, because only now seemingly is there a self to esteem. Previously at the socialized mind, it's more other esteem. And before that, there really isn't that much of a psychological self over time to esteem either. And a really interesting thing, again, is when you look at Nathaniel Branden's writings from that quite self-authored space, you see a strong emphasis on self-assertiveness, living consciously, taking personal responsibility, and having integrity, living a principled life. What critics of his work, sometimes emphasize, or what other people turn this whole self-esteem thing into, was just platitudes of positive thinking and approval, and you're special, and everyone's great, and your self-esteem is dependent upon how well you succeed, and get praise and approval, but that's that concept understood from a different form of mind. It's not at all what. So today, for example, you see a lot of criticism about that idea of self-esteem. This idea in the 60s and 70s, if only kids could raise their self-esteem and this and that. And then sometimes Nathaniel Branden gets held responsible for it. But the self-esteem, his understanding of self-esteem was radically different than what these people are criticizing. Because what happened, what was more a promotion of empty slogans and platitudes and encouragement of narcissism. But if you look at, and we can discuss whether self-esteem is a useful concept or all that sort of stuff, but if you look at it, narcissism and self-esteem, at least the way Branden would conceptualize it, are very different. And one way of pointing that out is if you look at when people's levels of narcissism tends to peak, it's in adolescence. And that Kegan stage 2, right? When are people's self-esteem often at their lowest? In adolescence. So as people age and mature, for a lot of people, especially if they develop some of these self-authoring capacities, their self-esteem, their comfort in their own skin, tends to increase often, and their level of narcissism tends to decrease proportionally. But someone who doesn't have these self-authoring capacities would be very likely to read out of a person like Branden or Rand hedonism, Andrew Tate, narcissism. But once again, quite different. So what might be some of the limitations of this self-authoring mind? Well, there are quite a few. So one is that they often have a tendency to confuse integrity with ideology, meaning they're so fused with that self-authored system of values and premises that essentially looks like who they are, and they're fused with that. So if they can't live out those values or speak their minds, it looks as if their entire sense of self, is at risk. But this is, to some extent at least, conflating integrity with ideology. Um, Something else too that's kind of important here. Kegan calls the self-authoring mind the institutional self, and sometimes if you spend time with people who are self-authored, you'll see that they're often quite principled, and they're often very ideological. And if you try to talk to them and connect with them, that institutional self is a nice expression, because it can almost seem as if everything you say or do gets filtered through this internal system, right? And so people can sometimes seem a bit aloof and stuck in their head. Quite often they can be on a constant self-improvement, self-actualization, reaching their goals, trying to achieve, type plan. And it can be a sense of over responsibility, and a lot of internal pressure that they put on themselves to live their values, and that can be quite exhaustive to them. They can, while they often have more tolerance for other people's, right to think differently, they can often, since they're fused with this self-authoring system, they can often have an extreme judgment of people who operate from that more self-sovereign or socialized mind, and just a belief that everyone else should be self-authoring like I am, that they should pull themselves up from their bootstraps and kind of claim their own self-authorship and own their own shit, and a strong judgment when people can't do that. And here, studying these sorts of developmental models can help to perhaps engender a bit more understanding and tolerance. Um, People can become confirmation bias machines too at this stage, meaning that they have a tendency to further their own agenda, and to only hear what really matches their own agenda, meaning that they can often be very curious about how other people see the world, but often to strengthen their own arguments. And they'll reject pretty much everything that doesn't fit into that agenda, or that self-authored space. Um, as Kegan points out, the self-authored mind seems to be the form of mind associated with modernity. So if you look at modernity from a kind of metaphysics, epistemology, values perspective, metaphysics, what is reality? Well, a more naturalistic way of understanding the world versus a supernatural way of understanding the world. Epistemology, how do we know what we know? Well, reason, using our senses to observe, and then using reason and experiments and science to try to discover the truth. There's often a strong emphasis on the scientific method, the value of reason, uh, objectivity, the belief that we can find truth through experimental methods. Um, Capitalism, of course, is often, although of course you have people have self-authored mind, who are Marxists or stuff like that, but it's often a more capitalistic society. Rights revolving around the individual, things like free speech. In my experience, people don't really get free speech before they get into that self-authored space. Because to really get free speech, you have to grant freedom of speech to your enemies. You have to grant freedom of speech to people whose opinions you may despise. You have to think in a principled way and go, for me to be free, I have to grant freedom to those idiots who have opinions I don't like, because that's the only way we can truly have freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is also the process of which we develop ideas and test them, and you can't really support self-authorship without free speech. So a society, now on an individual level, you'll find exceptions to this, but what I'm saying is that if you have a society where that self-authoring mind is more dominant, you're more likely to have free speech and rule of law and universal human rights. Is no longer based upon the group. You're more likely to have more capitalism and free trade, more democratic in a sense. If people believe in state power, you could also be an anarchist or a libertarian, obviously. You would have more emphasis on the scientific method. And at this stage of development, you really have Piaget's formal operations. The maximum separation between subject and object, a kind of left hemispheric way of viewing the world, where the world seems to be a multiplicity of separate objects being viewed by a distinct subject. That way of making meaning tends to begin to dissolve when people move beyond the self-authoring mind. So this very way of understanding the world has a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of strengths to it, but of course there also are some limitations to it as well. And before someone objects to that, I'm not so at an individual level, you may have people who are self-authoring who don't want democracies, or who even may be opponents of free speech. I'm saying at a group level, you're more likely to have. So if you read a book, for example, like Thomas Sowell's The Visions of the Anointed, he points towards this intellectual class of academics and activists and politicians who very often see themselves as the anointed, that they are particularly bright and educated, and it should be them and their ideological peers who should, plan economies and organize healthcare systems and kind of enforce their vision onto the population for the population's own good. And they see themselves as progressives and visionaries. And quite a few of these folks might have self-authoring capacities, but these folks are often people who don't quite recognize the rights of others to think for themselves, or perhaps because they have that arrogance and that belief in their own intelligence and the institutions that they are part of. But many of these people probably have self-authoring capacities, but may not necessarily support the kind of values that I just claimed to more often be associated with a self-authoring mind. So anyways, I hope this was useful and interesting. I'd love to see your comments, questions. If you agree, disagree, feel free to post. As always, if you would like to explore change work with me or mentoring, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2024, I have a online psychological illusion model training coming up in October, and a how I work with clients who struggle with anger masterclass in September. So if you look at the seminar page, you can find the information there. As always, thanks for listening.